Hi, I'm Dr. Kush Gupta, and I want to thank you for joining me on another episode of Medicine Mentors, where we interview masters in medicine, leading physicians at the top universities across the US to learn from their experiences and derive key insights, traits, and best practices that can guide medical students and residents. Today, we are speaking with Dr. Monika Safford. Dr. Safford is currently the professor and chief of the Division of General Internal Medicine at Weill Cornell Medicine. She received her medical degree from Weill Cornell and completed her residency in internal medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. She previously served at the University of Alabama at Birmingham as the inaugural endowed professor of diabetes prevention and outcomes research, assistant dean for continuing medical education, and associate director of the Center for Outcomes and Effectiveness Research and Education. With more than 260 papers published in top-tier journals, she's an expert researcher and has received various grants, including a recently awarded $10 million grant by the NIH. She has chaired many national committees and has been the recipient of many national honors and awards for her contributions to medicine. Welcome, Dr. Safford. It's really an honor to host you on our podcast.
Well, thank you so much. It's a delight to be here.
So, Dr. Safford, you have a career full of successes. I would like to hear of your journey from your childhood to current. What were the major events that shaped your success?
I grew up in a family that it was a little bit unusual. I had a mother who was an immigrant born in Austria. She remained an Austrian citizen all her life, but she was one of the most ardent defenders of the United States that you could possibly imagine. She grew up in Vienna during World War II and experienced the Marshall Plan after World War II. And people in her generation really, really loved America as a result of the rebuilding of Europe after World War II. My grandfather was a physician. He was one of the pioneers in rehabilitation medicine. My grandfather and my grandmother on my father's side was the first PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago. And her mentor was Margaret Mead. So she was a pioneer. My family background is one of pioneers. And I was drawn to medicine because of my grandfather. And also when I was in high school, I read the story of Ignaz Semmelweis. For those of you who are not familiar with his story, he was a physician in the 1800s in Budapest, and he was the man who discovered how important it was to wash hands before we really understood bacterial infection and the bacterial spread. But what really attracted me about his story was how resistant the medical community was to his message. He designed some very elegant experiments to demonstrate that hand washing really was the answer to reducing what they called at that time childbed fever, which was basically postpartum sepsis. And the practice at the time was that, physicians would just examine one woman internally, then wipe their hands on their lapels and move to the next woman. And in some hospitals, the death rate from postpartum sepsis was astronomical, like half of women were dying. So it was a desperate situation. He discovered the solution and his colleagues were very, very resistant. In fact, he committed suicide to demonstrate what he was trying to bring across by slitting his wrists, plunging them into a cadaver, which had a septic abdomen. And then, of course, he died 10 days later, and people still didn't believe him. So what really attracted me to this story was how we have a bunch of people who are devoted to science and facts and rigorous generation of data, and yet there was this resistance that we might be part of the problem. This story has repeated itself a number of times. Most recently that I'm familiar with is the story of H. pylori, where there was an Australian physician who had a very similar sort of thing. This mixture of science-based medicine, which is being carried out by humans who are very human and who have all the human foibles that all of us have, was really very attractive to me. That complexity really sort of cemented my conviction that I wanted to go to medical school. All along the way, one of the frustrations that I saw was how long it takes young investigators to become established. And, the average age, the bread and butter sign that you're an established investigator is a type of award called an R01 award from the NIH. And the average age of investigators getting their first R01 has been rising and rising. It's well into the early 40s at this point. And if you look at all the great minds in history, they did most of their great contributions in their 20s. So there's this mismatch between our current infrastructure and system that delays the independence of investigators until 20 years after they may have their most creative decade, which is a big problem for us and potentially could be slowing down medical progress. So one of the things that I vowed to do was to see if I could accelerate the career paths of young people through mentorship. And it's been one of the greatest joys of my life. I remember when I left UAB, one of my colleagues had a surprise reception for me where they invited all of my mentees. And it was a very large number of people who crowded that room. It was standing room only. And it was just an amazing moment to see all these people that I had touched that, over a 13-year time period, you sort of don't keep a catalog of these things. And it was just an amazing moment to see all these young people that were succeeding in part because of what I was able to help them with. So it was really an amazing experience. And then here at Weill, I've been here now for 4.5 years. I've had a tremendous amount of fun attracting and cultivating a research group. We have the 3 youngest members of our research group. All 3 of them now have career development awards from the NIH. And we have all of our investigators are funded. 4.5 years ago, there was only me. So it's really exciting to have built this in such a short time. And there's a lot of focus on health equity. Not everybody is a health equity researcher, but many of the investigators are very much focused on how can we change our healthcare system? How can we do a better job to give everybody an opportunity at good health? So that's my story.
You mentioned you sought balance in personal and professional life at a time when it was extremely uncommon to have women to have that kind of balanced life that you wanted. How did you overcome those challenges and achieve that balance at that time?
Well, I mean, for me, it was going into private practice and working part-time. I still think that academic medicine is an extremely challenging field, and for that matter, clinical medicine, especially if you're in one of the intellectual pursuit. And that's what our healthcare system currently, the pressures are for physicians to do that sort of thing. So although I didn't have role models that were women, but I think the same sorts of pressures for work-life balance exist today. And I am a very big fan if you can afford it. There are a lot of young people coming out of medical school with huge debts. So being able to afford part-time work is not going to be a reality for everybody, especially if you're from a disadvantaged background and you had to take out very big loans to afford undergraduate and medical school. But if you can afford it, I highly recommend to people, to women especially, or whoever's going to be the primary caregiver for the child, to work part-time so that you can have more time, more unhurried time with the child. I remember growing up, or when my children were growing up, they grew up for 8 years in New Jersey before we moved to Alabama. That was quite a move. But they were some of the few children who didn't have, 3 or 4 activities scheduled after school every day, because I really believe in unstructured time. You have to give kids an opportunity to bump their noses a little bit. So until my youngest child was in kindergarten, I worked 4 days a week at most. And that was, in retrospect, one of the best things I ever did. It didn't advance my academic career, but it certainly made me happy. And I think that's really what it's all about, the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, right?
You mentioned the hyper structuring of the day of their schedule, especially for kids, how that can have a detrimental effect on the long-term goals that we're trying to achieve. Could you associate that with resident education or medical education?
So I think, there has been a little bit of recognition that you need to schedule in downtime. So for example, now there's time off really from classes for medical students to study for their boards, which I think is a terrific evolving trend. There's a tremendous amount of structure that doesn't really allow you to govern your own time. And when you turn your attention to a research career, you have no structure. So it's very typical for fellows when they're doing their research experience to feel like a snap rubber band where they're sort of flailing around because there's no schedule and they don't quite know what to do with that. So it can be a very rough transition for a lot of young investigators. It's not meant as a criticism. I think that there's a huge amount to learn. And our approach to medical education and training, although I think we can self-reflection and evaluation and continued perfection is always room for improvement. But I think most people consider this to be the best medical training that's available in the world.
That is the part of the journey that we undertake, right?
Yes, very much so. And that's, I think, where mentorship is key. Because, if you have a good mentor, I've mentored several fellows since coming to Weill Cornell. There's always a discussion in the beginning about, you have to impose your own structure. Part of the beauty of choosing a research career is that you can really structure it around your own strengths.
Can you walk me through a mentor who has had an impact on your life? How did you find that mentor? And specifically, what contributions did they make in your personal or professional growth?
Well, probably one of the most fun experiences I had, which was a relatively short mentorship experience, but one that I enjoyed greatly, and I think that he did as well, was with Seth Landefeld, who is now the chair of medicine at UAB. And when I was recruited to Cornell, he made a heroic effort to try to retain me at UAB. And we would meet once a week. He really challenged me to think about, what do I want to do in the next few years? And he really helped me to reflect on what it was that I wanted to do next. Because at UAB, I was really at the pinnacle of a career. I was a full professor. I had an endowed professorship. I had a very vibrant research program. I had over 200 publications. I was being recognized nationally and internationally. So, I was at a point where I could easily have continued to do that for another 20 years and call it quits. But he really pushed me to recognize that I wanted to do more. And I never really sought out leadership positions, but I recognized that what you gain in a leadership position that was attractive to me is influence. I'm not a very hierarchical person. All of my work is done in teams, and that's sort of my natural leadership style. But the reality is that most of academic medicine is quite hierarchical. And I recognized that in order to have the influence that I wanted to have, I really needed to have a leadership position, a fairly senior leadership position. And I just really enjoyed the way he pushed me. He wanted a timeline and he wanted a budget, and he looked really, really hard to find the resources that I needed to do what I wanted to do.
We discussed a lot of stories about how there can be a lot of resistance when newer ideas come forward. What advice do you have for residents to not be oblivious to innovation?
The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, injustice in healthcare is the most inhumane. And that really has been one of the driving focal sort of kernel of truth that has driven my entire career. We really have a lot of work to do in medicine to do some very, very painful self-reflection. I think an example is looking for where is systemic racism embedded into healthcare. And, you sort of scratch your head, do we really have embedded racism? Well, yes, we certainly do. There's this recent paper that was in the New England Journal of Medicine that gave examples across one subspecialty after another of the way the historical roots of racism manifest in the present day. So things like adjusting estimated glomerular filtration rate for race, which results in interpretation of EGFR for Blacks being rosier than it actually is. I heard yesterday a presentation of one of our pediatrics faculty who worked all summer with a group of students in the context of the Center for Health Equity, where they looked at pulmonary function tests, spirometry results, which are race stratified norms. Why is that? Because African Americans have worse lung function than whites on average, even ones, that you get African Americans from the general community, not people who have any kind of lung problems. The historical tenets of that are this horrible perpetration of the myth that African Americans are in some way not humans the way the rest of humanity is. which was the myth that had to be perpetrated in order to allow white supremacists to continue to hold slaves and still consider themselves to be upright citizens. And the vestiges of that continues to the present day is appalling. And I think it is much more likely that we have the necessary self-reflection to remove these kinds of vestiges. I think a lot of that is going to have to come from students and from trainees holding us accountable. Because, the further you get on in your career and in your years, you do get to be a little bit set in your ways. And young people have these fresh eyes and fresh perspectives. There are countless examples that you don't see that. When you get back a test result, it doesn't say that A, that it is adjusted for race, and B, why. We have a huge opportunity, and I think the young people are the ones who are going to drive this forward.
As you mentioned, some people can be set in their ways as they move ahead in their careers. So what is it that you have done to maintain that state of peak service attitude and this innovative approach?
Sure. The key is teams and diversity on the teams. So, we say that we have medical teams, but we don't really function as teams, because a real team is like, you think about a sports team. Those are real teams. And part of it is that you have very distinct roles on a sports team. So a really well-functioning soccer team, people play their positions. And although we have residents and we have attendings and we have students, we don't necessarily have those kinds of roles as clearly defined, where, students are sort of a group. You may have an epidemiologist, you may have somebody who's a biostatistician. So you have a variety of different expertise around the table. And then the job of the leader, of the principal investigator, is to make sure that everybody feels very, very comfortable voicing their opinion, even if it's in contrast to what is being described. And I encourage that. That is how you stay on your toes, because I really want people to challenge what we're proposing. Pick it apart. What is good about it? What is not good about it? I often find that the students on the team are the ones who come with the freshest insights. So if you give students permission to speak and to be upstarts and to challenge, they'll take that opportunity, but they have to be made to feel comfortable because there's such a power differential. I work very, very hard on our teams to create that kind of an atmosphere for where every single person on the team feels comfortable expressing their perspective. As a result, I constantly learn new things, and I consider some of the weaknesses in the designs or in the approach that we're taking and how those weaknesses should influence the way that we present our results. So I think teams are the answer. Everyone on the team working at their peak in different areas is how you get a very, very exciting group together who really enjoys working together.
Throughout your career, you've been involved you have mentored probably thousands of residents and medical students. What are the traits and habits of the most successful of these that you have come across?
Dedication, fortitude. I mean, a research career is a really, really challenging thing. People who self-reflect and understand their own strengths and limitations, I think that's a really, really important part of growth. And I think for almost all of my mentees, there is this acceptance or receptivity to the idea that the goal should not be that you become the expert at everything. The goal should be that you learn how to put teams together who can overcome your weaknesses, allowing people and helping people, encouraging them to really reflect on what are my weaknesses, because we kind of skirt away from that. That's a little painful. It's not really pleasant to think about your weaknesses. You like to dwell on your strengths. And I do think that the people who succeed are able to really work in their area of talent and passion and excellence as much as they possibly can. And that's what I have seen a lot of my mentees able to do, is to identify what that area is and really focus and design your day so that you're spending as much time in that area as you possibly can and as little time in all the other stuff that you don't enjoy doing. Of course, there's a lot of that drudgery. Can't get away from it. But understanding where your strengths and your limitations are, I think, is a very, very key attribute to the successful mentee.
So if I were to ask you to pinpoint one thing that would be your advice to young physicians, what would that be?
I think one of the ironies in life is that you're usually asked to make gigantic life decisions at a time in your life when you are not equipped to make those decisions in a fully informed way. Where are you going to go to college? Where are you going to go to medical school? Where are you going to go to residency? You always have sort of an inkling. And I think one of the most important lessons is listen to that inner voice. Say, okay, that's some sort of an intuition, and I can't trust intuition. I have to be more evidence-based. Definitely not. Trust your intuition. You can tell when something is out of kilter. So for these big life decisions, definitely pay attention to that inner voice. I think that's one of the most important lessons. Examine, why do you feel something is not right? And work hard to find allies who can help you to voice that in a safe way. It's very challenging for young people to criticize the established norms. But it's very important that we figure out a way to allow young people to do that, because you have fresh perspectives, and that is exactly what is needed to continue to perfect systems. So, finding a way to voice your concerns, I think. Persevere is another lesson, is don't give up. If it's really important to you and you really believe in it, don't give up.
Can you share some of the challenges that you faced on this journey and how you overcame them?
Yes. So a very, very important tenet that I believe in is that you learn a hell of a lot more from your failures than you do from your successes. So don't be afraid to fail. I always challenge my investigators. If you are doing studies and every single one of them is succeeding, you're not pushing yourself hard enough. Because if you are at the leading edge, it means you should be failing about half the time. That constant pushing yourself and not looking at a failure as something that you need to quickly move past and sweep under the rug as quickly as possible. But commit to yourself that every single failure is a learning opportunity. And what went wrong here? What was it that led to this failure? And what can I do differently moving forward? There's really any number of examples. I have more failures than I have successes. And I think that's a very, very key lesson for anyone, not just in science, but in life. If you have a relationship that didn't work out, why didn't it work out? Don't just move on as quickly as possible to get away from the pain, but think about it, reflect on it. What was it that was it not a good fit? Did I have to try too hard to make this relationship work? And maybe the next time, if I get into a relationship, I should keep tabs on how hard I'm working to make it work.
You have attained a very unique balance of your personal life and your professional life that is very hard to achieve. So how have you really done that? If there are any tools or questions or tips that if there's one thing that I can remember on a day-to-day basis or think about so as to achieve this?
It's a journey. It is honesty, being very honest with yourself. I think a lot of times we do tend to gloss over our limitations, embracing your weaknesses instead of trying to hide them. I think those are really important things. And also, this sort of self-reflection, what am I good at? What am I not good at? Part of that should also be, what do I really need to do to be a happy person? It's finding whatever is the balance that's right for you. I think this personalization and just recognizing who you really are and what really makes you happy. So that, I think, is really a very, very important part of the journey is self-acceptance and making sure you're paying attention to the things that really matter to you.
This has been really insightful. Thank you, Dr. Safford. I'm taking away some critical insights from this interview that I believe will help me become a better student. Follow your inner voice, have an open-minded approach, and be open to innovation. Your inner voice will guide you through most of the challenges that you come across and help you make those important decisions that we worry about, the decisions that have a long-term impact on our lives. Self-reflect and be honest with yourself when you do that, to hold ourselves accountable and identify our weaknesses and our strengths, and to utilize that information for personal growth, and to also address the socio-cultural issues in medicine through self-reflection. And thirdly, to work in teams. When we work in teams, our goal should be to put together a team to overcome individual weaknesses so as to maximize the expertise of each individual to bring most to the table and to give people who may not be as comfortable a chance to be open in discussions and to put forth their critical insights about the subject matter. And lastly, do not be afraid to fail. If you're failing, just reflect afterwards. Do not be disheartened. Do not move on too fast either, but reflect. And this will really help us in our personal growth. And that our personal growth will eventually help the overall growth of the people around us, of our patients eventually.
Your interviewing skills are outstanding.
Thank you so much. To our audience, thank you for tuning in with us here on the Medicine Mentors. Thank you for joining us as we learn from the masters of medicine.